I'm so very tired. I'm so tired. I should have started this way earlier. I thought I had it handled. I did not. Okay. So, my rewrite is Elizabetta. The first page of my draft. I'll flip it in post. But for my story, I give the brothers names and the lover names. The oldest is Casimir, Destroyer of Peace. The middle is Hildebrand, Battle Sword. The youngest is Craven, Cowardly Man. And the lover is Lancelot, and means servant. Throughout the physical, or the draft, these are like shortened versions of the names to like save space. Let's begin. Just a quick peek at what you're in for in this part. I'm gonna start with a cold open. You're supposed to be confused in the beginning. It's my intention. Lisabetta's eyes were cold, empty, completely devoid of the light they once held, the front of her dress stained with speckles of blood. She examined Craven with an absent stare, seemingly nothing left behind her gaze. As she parted her skirt, lifted her leg high enough to be level with Hildebrand's crimson-bathed throat, before her heel made contact with his chest, sending body, sword, and head tumbling over the edge and into the surging sea. Craven tried to reason with her, pleaded, even begged for her to see reason, but Lisabetta could not hear her brother's incessant wailing over the fury and anguish that swelled within her heart. Her fingers curled around the hilt of her final weapon, with great care, caressing her thumb along the engraved C in her brother's pickaxe. The blade of the tool dragged behind her as she approached Craven, his prayers of mercy now changed to whispered apologies as he backed himself up against the cliff's edge. Looking over his shoulder and seeing his fate below, Craven tried one last time to persuade his sister to reconsider. Lisabetta, my dearest sister, please don't do this. I beg of thee. Please. There was a pause in Lisabetta's movements, letting a shrivel of hope creep into Craven's heart, but it was short-lived as Lisabetta muttered a query to her brother. Did my beloved plead for his life the same way as you are now? Did he grovel for his master's mercy and pray to our Lord above for a shred of grace? Is this how he sounded when he was met with the blade that would decide his fate? Craven attempted to protest, but was ultimately cut off by agonizing pain as Lisabetta lifted his pick above her head and plunged it deep into his left shoulder, rendering him unbalanced as he tumbled backwards over the cliff face, managing a quick glance at his sister's unmoving expression, watching him fall into the ocean's gaping maw below. There was a time when Lisabetta was the most gentle creature known to man. Her every touch was soft and filled with affection, her gaze warm and able to touch the coldest of hearts. Lisabetta was cherished and adored by all who knew her, but none treasured her more than her father. Her father, a well-respected duke amongst the community, doted on Lisabetta quite extensively, sharing her with endearment and tenderness that seemed to have no end. The duke's love for his daughter was all-encompassing, but it also left him blind to his negligence. You see, before Lisabetta, the duke had 3 sons. Casimir, the oldest, was a beast like no other. He was as much of a fiend as he was a barbarian, using his aggression and brute strength to force himself to the top, more often than not using violence to solve all his problems. Hildebrand, the second oldest, had more of a level head on his shoulders, but that didn't make him any less cruel. His intellect was frequently used to scorn and intimidate those below him. With a single glance, he renders any competitors petrified, making them easy to dispose of and leaving him the only victor. Craven, the youngest brother, was sturdy and resourceful, but, unlike his brothers, he lacked the pride needed to get him anywhere. Craven was a coward. He is easily manipulated and has never made a decision without an outside influence. With their father's unconcealed favoritism, the three brothers were the only ones able to resist Lisabetta's enchantment. Her charm was rendered useless against the bitter grudge that seemed to have rooted itself in her brothers' hearts. Alongside the priceless jewels and gifts bestowed upon Lisabetta by her father, she was also appointed a generous portion of her father's estate in the event of his passing. This did not sit well with Casimir, as he had his eyes on the plentiful acres that resided on the property, and intended to clear them out to make room for a tavern to house his numerous parties and brawls. With the space in the hands of his childish sister, he had no doubt that she would make little change to the grounds and transform it into a place for the public to enjoy. Casimir believed that anything he wanted from his father's possessions, including properties, was his birthright as the oldest son, but he was unable to protest with violence, as he normally does, because harming Lisabetta would only hinder his reputation with their father. Casimir attempted to persuade Hildebrand to use his smarts and aid him in attaining the property, but without receiving anything for his assistance, Hildebrand saw little to no need to support his brother in his troubles. That is to say, he saw no need to support his brother until Lancelot was caught. Lancelot, a quiet and charming young man, comes from a long line of slaves and servants who have served the Duke and his family for generations. Despite coming from poverty, Lancelot spoke with a dignified tone and always presented himself with such confidence that someone, if they didn't know any better, might mistake him for a prestigious gentleman playing dress-up as a commoner. Unlike those before him, Lancelot was well-read and educated. Oftentimes he could be found beneath a tree, reading quietly to himself, or telling stories to the younger children servants. It is at one of these story times that Lancelot is spotted by Lisabetta. One day, Lisabetta was out on a walk, when she stumbled upon Lancelot's secret story circle and instantly fell in love with his words. The way he spoke lulled Lisabetta into silly daydreams with fire-breathing dragons and enchanting wizards. Once the story ended and the children dispersed, Lisabetta approached Lancelot, and the rest was history. For months the two seemed to disappear hours at a time into the forest, and only returned together under the cover of night. Lancelot had never met someone who treated his stories like they had been written by the stars, and the two fell deeply in love. However, young love can be incredibly dangerous and can often cause one to be careless with secrets. Craven, being the youngest son, regularly ended up picking the shortest straw in life. In his father's will, he is given the smallest and least desired plot of land. On excursion, he is stuck with handling luggage or simply staying in the carriage. In the workplace, he received little to no recommendation from his father and only managed to snag himself a major position in a coal mine. That being said, because Craven has been taught to expect the bare minimum, he has learned to make the best out of it. Because he had no property to his name and his only asset was a singular room in his father's home, he put his all into his work and quickly climbed the ranks. He even went and spent his first salary on an expensive pickaxe. The pick was custom designed, having a steel blade that peeled through coal like butter, and a handle made of hickory with a C engraved in the center. One day, when returning from the mines, Craven came across a troubling sight. His sister, sneaking through the brush hand in hand with the servant boy. Shifting behind a tree to conceal himself, Craven watched as the two recovered from a particularly loud giggle fit, shushing and pushing each other as they approached the manor. Through more stifled giggles, Lancelot hoisted Lisabetta onto his shoulders so that she could reach her bedroom window and climb inside. After some giddy whispers, Lancelot made his way back to the servants' quarters, and Lisabetta locked her window and arranged the curtains as if nothing had happened. Disturbed by this, Craven immediately went to his brothers with the news. Lisabetta is doing what with a servant boy? Casimir slammed his wooden tankard of ale onto the bar countertop with a furious glint behind his eyes. That despicable mongrel! How dare he even look at a lady? Someone from his background shouldn't even breathe in her direction. Control yourself, Casimir, Hildebrand hissed as he rubbed the stress building in his brow. Hildebrand took a controlled breath before placing a firm hand on Craven's shoulders, squeezing it threateningly. Craven, you are positive you saw them fraternizing? Are you sure Lisabetta was not simply berating him? Before Craven could reply, Casimir interrupted. Come now, Hal, even I'm smart enough to know Lisabetta is too soft to say anything crass to anyone. Casimir's words were laced with venom as he sneered at his younger brothers. Something must be done about this. You're the one who's so uptight about family legacy, Hildebrand. What are you going to do about this stain on the family name? Casimir was right about this. Hildebrand took reputation very seriously. He believed any slander associated with the family name was a slander to himself, and that was not taken too lightly. Every waking moment of his life was spent perfecting his reputation. A council meeting here, a banquet there, anything to get him in good favor with as many people as possible. Even being the son of a duke wasn't good enough for him. No, he needed his own title, something separate from his father. This revelation was what led him to pursue knighthood. Sure, Hildebrand wasn't the most patriotic man on earth, but he could act the part well enough to make it believable. He trained tirelessly to remain exceptional amongst his fellow knights, even being at the forefront of battle on a few occasions. To ensure he had every advantage, Hildebrand had an arming sword forged by the most reputable blacksmith the country had ever seen. A high-carbon steel blade to guarantee a balance between flexibility and strength, with a hardwood hilt wrapped in sharkskin to provide an unmoving grip. Hildebrand used this sword in every fight and had won him many battles, but all his work and training would be wasted if his reputation were ruined by something so trivial. If this scandal gets out, his image, honor, and legacy would be permanently tainted, staining his name forever. This would not do. Hildebrand would not let this happen. They seemed genuinely happy together, fretted Craven, looking between his brothers' equally baffled expressions before continuing meekly. I'm just saying maybe this could be an easy fix. If we just get Lancelot alone and explain to him the issue with the public knowing about them, then maybe he will understand and back off. Craven looked at his brothers in anticipation, waiting to see if he needed to backtrack on his statement based on their reactions. Casimir simply mumbled, God, you're an embarrassment, before taking a swig of his drink. Hildebrand let out an exasperated sigh as he rested his forehead in his hand. Honestly, Craven, I cannot possibly imagine how you thought that would be a good idea. Hildebrand suddenly stopped, speaking mid-sentence, causing Casimir to look up from his mug with a cocked brow. Hildebrand was perked up, ideas flashing behind his eyes as an evil plan to make its way to the surface. For once, dear brother, he began, a wicked smile creeping upon his face, you actually might have an excellent idea. Casimir also began to don a sickening grin as he began to catch onto his little brother's scheme, leaving only Craven out of the loop. I do? Craven asked in astonishment, feeling a weird, fluttering sensation in his abdomen. Could this be pride? The thought nearly entered his mind before Hildebrand's unnerving voice cut through his concentration. Indeed you do, dear brother. Hildebrand let out a sinister chuckle as his devious plot slowly constructed itself in his head. Yes, that is just what we need to do. get him alone, somewhere far away, so that Lisabetta will not catch us, but also somewhere where we will have total control. Hildebrand's smile widened as he thought of all the possibilities of the successful outcome of his plan. Someone where no one will look for him, Casimir added on, refilling his tankard, matching Hildebrand's growing smile. Why would anyone look for him? The moment the words left Craven's lips, he knew the answer. He looked at his older brothers as they met his gaze with equally malicious eyes. Surely we don't have to go that far. We could just... Before Craven could continue to protest his brother's plans, the dense hand of Casimir found its way to his shoulder and pushed him into a chair. Think, Craven, Casimir began, filling a second tankard and sliding it between Craven's shaking hands. We have no power over Lisabetta. The old fart would do anything to keep her happy, even letting her marry a filthy peasant. Hildebrand nodded in agreement, seating himself on the other side of Craven to lay the pressure on harder. And when the two get hitched, you'll be even lower on Father's priority list. You think he'd favor you over the man who made his precious Lisabetta happy? You might as well not even be a lord anymore. The brothers leered as Craven gripped his cup, the color draining from his face. Craven took a quick swig of his drink before wiping his mouth and saying, "Fine, I'm in." It was the next day when the brothers moved in to strike. The three found Lancelot in the scullery, scrubbing pots and pans with a wire brush, humming a tune only known to himself. Hildebrand and Casimir entered normally, while Craven stayed outside out of view, knowing full well his facial expression would give away their plan. With his back to the entrance, Lancelot was the only one aware of the brothers' presence, ignorant of his fellow servants fleeing from the room and closing the door behind them. Once Lancelot noticed the abnormal amount of quiet during the busiest time of day, he turned around to find the two young masters of the home. "My lords!" exclaimed Lancelot, wiping his hands off on his apron and turning to face them. "Whatever do I owe the pleasure?" Hildebrand was the first to speak, stepping further into the scullery with a deep chuckle. "Oh, don't start with the pleasantries now, not after what you've done with our dear sister." Lancelot's face instantly lost all its color, slowly backing up into the sink as he stumbled over his words. Well, you see, Lancelot was snapped out of his panic by an aggressive slap on the back from Casimir. "Don't be like that. If our dear Lisabetta is happy, we're happy." Casimir was quite good at falsifying his own happiness. His cheerful smile and friendly pat on the back were enough to make Lancelot feel completely at ease. "Lisabetta is our dear younger sister, after all. We want her to be happy no matter what." Hildebrand was less talented at faking joy, opting for a faint smile and keeping his hands politely in front of him. "This is exactly why we have come to you today, to talk about Lisabetta's happiness." Hildebrand approached Lancelot, his smile already straining, shooting a glance at Casimir to take over. "Yes, I'm sure your silly peasant humor is keeping her entertained, but we have an even better idea." Hildebrand internally rolled his eyes at Casimir's pathetic attempt at kindness, quickly taking back the reins from his older brother before they were caught. "You see, it is Lisabetta's birthday soon, and we just know she would love a damask rose from you." Hildebrand's grin widened at Lancelot's confused expression. "A damask rose? What's that? Some kind of flower?" "Some kind of flower? You mean Lisabetta's favorite flower in the whole world," Casimir explained loudly, once again taking over the conversation and wrapping his arm round Lancelot's back. "And you're in luck. Our father has recently bought an island estate where the flowers grow naturally, just off the coast." Before Casimir could seal the deal and present their proposition, Hildebrand separated the two and shoved Casimir aside, clasping his hands together for added positivity. "What my brother is trying to say is, we are inviting you to come with us to inspect the new estate and to pick a flower for our dear Lisabetta." Casimir let out an annoyed grunt as he crossed his arms, watching Lancelot's face light up with excitement. "Really? You'd let me do that, my lord?" Lancelot was so blinded by the possibility of retrieving this special flower for Lisabetta that he seemed to have missed the sinister chuckle Hildebrand let out. "Of course, anything for our dear Lisabetta," answered Hildebrand. "Meet us at the dock in 3 days' time, and you will accompany us to the estate." Hildebrand grinned as Lancelot nodded his head in excitement. In 3 days' time, Lancelot would board a boat to find a flower for his dear Lisabetta, but he would never return. Ta-da! More story. When the 4 men arrived at the estate, Lancelot was the first off the boat, quickly grabbing hold of the dock lines and securing the ship to the pier. Casimir was next to get off, untying the boat and doing it over himself, as he didn't trust a peasant to tie a knot. Next was Hildebrand, his hand resting maliciously on the hilt of his sheathed sword. Lastly was Craven, who clumsily landed on the dock, holding onto the dock pilings for balance. With him, he carried the only keys to the estate and his trusty pickaxe hoisted over his shoulder. As the 4 approached the estate, Lancelot ran ahead, marveling at the building's ivory pillars and intricate statues. Hildebrand and Casimir followed, snickering to each other while Craven lagged behind, each step digging a deeper pit into his stomach. The day was short. Craven catered to Hildebrand as he inspected the structure of the new estate, while Casimir supervised Lancelot, admiring the damask roses. The flower was stunning, as everything the family owned was, but this plant was a natural beauty, not something manufactured. The aroma produced by the flower was so sweet that it brought tears to anyone within a 10-foot radius. The plant was a deep pink color and double-flowered, leaving it densely petaled with ruffled blooms. Hildebrand and Craven watched from the glass turret above. The tower jutted out of the main building nearly 20 feet and overlooked the entire estate. To the right, the beach where they docked, sunlight dancing across the sand surface. To the front, the estate's garden, decorated with a multitude of exotic plants, with the damask rose being the majority. And to the left, a simple gravel path that ends in a sudden precipice into the angry sea below. The cliff overlooks the ocean in its entirety, but it's really just a hazard to someone not paying attention. As the sun began to set upon the horizon, Hildebrand let out a soft chuckle as Craven tensed. "Go start digging, Craven." Beside the garden stood a mighty oak tree, its branches reaching toward the sky like wayward sinners holding out their hands to the heavens above for a second chance. As Craven dug behind that mighty oak tree, he couldn't help but feel his own sins crawling upon his back. Despite the sound of his pickaxe meeting rock and the abundance of voices in his head, nothing could drown out the sounds of Lancelot's pleas and cries. It wasn't long after the cries died that Casimir and Hildebrand approached. Craven tried to look away and remove himself from the experience, but his ears betrayed him. The sound of a limp body hitting the dirt ground was something that would haunt him for years to come. His older brothers were much less fazed. Casimir, having killed many a man over petty disagreements, dropped the body into the hole with ease, dusting his hands off on his shirt. And Hildebrand, having also killed many in the line of battle, admired the clean cut he had made on his victim's severed head before tossing it into the hole as well. "Bury it and meet us back on the boat. It's getting late." Hildebrand spoke in a detached whisper, sheathing his sword before turning on his heels and walking back toward the dock, Casimir following close behind. Craven could only begin filling the hole. There was nothing he could do any more. Not being able to look at the pickaxe without being reminded of what he had done, the tool was left there, leaning against the great oak tree. Over the next 5 days, Lisabetta asked for Lancelot. With each passing day, she grew even more worried. "Dear Lisabetta, we told you that the servant boy was sent away on business overseas to work on the estate. Why are you so insistent on the whereabouts of him anyway?" In order to keep her secret safe, Lisabetta did not answer Hildebrand's question, but his answer did little to ease the gnawing feeling in her stomach. On the 5th morning, Lisabetta went to Casimir and asked him about the whereabouts of Lancelot. Having been bombarded with his sister's questions for 5 days too many, Casimir snapped in frustration. "Would you quit asking about that peasant bastard? If you keep bothering me about him, you'll share his fate." With that proclamation, Casimir stomped away, unaware of what he had revealed to Lisabetta. Though the rational side of her said otherwise, Lisabetta still had hope that Lancelot was still alive. Perhaps he was just in a dungeon, or was sentenced to work on the island instead of the manor. With her final shred of sanity, Lisabetta convinced her brothers to let her travel to the estate, as she had recently found out that damask roses grew there. With an opportunity to get away from their sister's incessant whining, the brothers immediately agreed. The boat ride to the estate was silent. There were no waves, no wind, not even the sound of a passing seagull. It was as if everything in the world had died, and now it was just Lisabetta on a boat, sailing wherever her heart took her. Lisabetta fell to her knees as throbbing sobs ripped their way through her. She pulled and tugged at her collar, feeling as though she was suffocating in her own tears. Somehow she found the strength to drag herself towards the distilled earth, plunging her hands into the fresh dirt and beginning to dig. Another wave of wails tore itself through her throat as she uncovered a nose, then a mouth, then the entire severed head of her lover. For many hours she sat there, cradling the head against her as if that could somehow bring her love back to her. Lisabetta cried and yelled and bawled until there were no tears left to be shed and her voice failed. When she began to hear servants exiting the boat and calling out for her to return, she hurriedly grabbed a nearby pot and gingerly placed her lover's head inside, covering it with a generous amount of soil before planting a damask seed inside it. Lisabetta wept into the pot as the servants helped her into the boat and into the cabin. Lisabetta wept into that pot as the servants helped her into the boat and into the cabin. She wept into the pot as she exited the boat, and wept into the pot as she entered her room. Lisabetta wept into that pot for 4 weeks, spilling every ounce of tears she had into its soil, feeding its roots with her immeasurable sorrow. By the beginning of week 5, Casimir had had enough. While Hildebrand advised him to just ignore her wails, Casimir found difficulty understanding how a woman, whose memory is weak and holds onto memories for very little time, is still grieving over a peasant boy she had a momentary relationship with. His patience finally snapped when he was returning to his room for the night and heard the cries of Lisabetta die down. He thought that, perhaps, his sister had finally gotten over this silly phase, but his hopes were quickly shattered when the sobs returned, louder than ever before. With his tolerance running on fumes, Casimir found himself kicking Lisabetta's bedroom door down with an exasperated yell. He found his sister sprawled out on her bed, clutching a flower pot which housed a sad damask rose sprout. Registering the cause of her sorrow was the reminder of the flower, Casimir swiftly snatched the pot from his sister's feeble hands and marched back to his room. Lisabetta, shrieking, only became louder as she pulled and tugged on her brother's shirt, begging for the flower to be returned to her. Casimir argued with Lisabetta that the flower was only making things worse, and her dramatics were becoming infuriating. As Lisabetta continued to protest, Craven and Hildebrand exited their rooms to see what the racket was about. Craven approached Lisabetta with a reassuring tone. "Sister, please, you are in mourning. Having this plant around will only make the process harder for you. Removing it is for your own good." Craven held Lisabetta back as Casimir placed the pot in his room and locked the door. Seeing the odds were against her, Lisabetta looked to Hildebrand to offer reason to the argument and to convince the others to return her pot. But Hildebrand leaned against the door frame with a blank expression, simply waiting for Lisabetta to tire herself out and go to bed. However, what Hildebrand didn't know was that his sword was in full view of the hallway, unsheathed and leaning against the wall. The dried blood along the blade almost glowed in the candlelight of the corridor. Lisabetta's heart sank as she stopped struggling. Casimir muttered, "Good Lord, she's quiet at last," before shooing the three away and returning to his room. Hildebrand did the same as Craven let go of Lisabetta, who slowly backed into her room and closed the door. Craven gave a sigh of relief as the door locked, seeing that his sister would finally get the closure she needed to heal and everything could go back to normal. The next morning, Lisabetta approached her brothers during breakfast, requesting one last visit to the estate to say one final goodbye. Seeing no need to try to hide what they had done anymore, the brothers agreed to the request on the condition that she would stop the continuous crying. Lisabetta agreed and set sail back to the estate. Lisabeth sat at her lover's grave and wept softly, holding a bundle of damask roses tightly in her hands. As the sun began to set and her visit approached its end, a sparkle of light caught her Lisabetta's eyes. Her gaze landed on the blade of a pickaxe, leaning leisurely against a mighty oak tree in a puddle of damask rose petals. The raging heat of sorrow in her heart was suddenly cooled with a chilling sensation. Her tears dried, and her cries ceased. Lisabetta stood with shaking feet as she approached the pick. She gripped the hilt with a firm grab, letting it drag behind her as she disappeared into the garden. A full 2 days passed before the brothers set out for the estate. When night fell on Lisabetta's visit, the servants exited the boat and searched for her. They searched the manor, the garden, the beach, the turret, the cliffside. Nothing. In fear of something terrible happening to their lady, the servants quickly returned to the dock and began sailing away to inform the others. It wasn't until the ship was a mile from shore that a servant spotted Lisabetta on the dock, watching them leave. However, when the servants returned to the dock, Lisabetta had once again disappeared, and the servants were unable to find her on the island. The servants tried to leave 3 more times. Each time, Lisabetta would appear on the dock and would flee when they approached. Unable to think of a way to get Lisabetta onto the boat, the servants returned without her. Of course, when the servants docked without their sister, the brothers were furious. However, word of Lisabetta's disappearance reached the ear of their father, who demanded that the 3 of them go themselves to the estate and retrieve her. The 3 brothers begrudgingly boarded the boat and set sail for the estate. On the way, the brothers devised a plan. Based on the servant's tale, Lisabetta would disappear when the servants were on the grounds, but would reappear on the dock when they had left. If this were true, one of the brothers could secretly stay on the island while the other 2 sail away. Once that brother catches Lisabetta, he will light a fire to signal for them to return. Ultimately, Casimir was chosen to retrieve Lisabetta, as Hildebrand saw no need to involve himself in something that was so far beneath him, and Craven simply could not overpower a grieving woman. The other 2 laughed at this statement as they reached the island. From noon to dusk, the 3 brothers searched the island haphazardly and with very little drive. When they found nothing at nightfall, Casimir climbed upon the boat before sneakily lowering himself into the water and swimming his way to the other side of the island. Once Casimir was out of sight, Hildebrand and Craven untied the boat and sailed away. The 2 brothers sailed far enough that the island was a speck in the distance and waited, and waited, and waited, but a flame never came. "Do you think something's happened?" Craven asked squeamishly, straining his eyes to try and get a better look at the island. "Don't be absurd, Craven," Hildebrand hissed. "I'm sure that fool just fell asleep. We'll redock, and I will find Lisabetta. I should have known this was much too hard a job for that oaf to handle." Hildebrand sighed before standing and went to turn the ship around, beginning their journey back to the island. Once the ship was secured, Hildebrand jumped onto the dock, instructing Craven to stay put, and, with a steady hand on the hilt of his sword, Hildebrand re-entered the estate. It was only a few minutes after Hildebrand disappeared from view that Craven heard the sound of his brother's screams. Craven stumbled over the side of the boat and onto the dock with a painful thud. He held his bruised ribs for a moment before scampering to his feet and sprinting toward the noise. With no candles to light his way, Craven was unsurprised to trip over something. What he was surprised about was the cause of his tumble having the familiar feel to human flesh. Craven knew what it must be, but he still couldn't help but let out an unintelligible scream. 2 feet before him was the body of Casimir. The left side of his skull was bashed in, blood pooling beneath his head and flowing towards the sea. The weapon used could be seen scattered about the crime scene, a clay piece here, a ceramic shard there, and a collection of large rocks strewn about. Casimir had succumbed to a pot full of rocks, the irony pulling and tugging at Craven's stomach as he struggled to his feet. He looked up at the turret where the pot was surely thrown from, but a glint of light caught his eye as he turned. There, on the cliff's ledge, knelt Hildebrand. His face was frozen in fear, but his eyes were emotionless and milky white. Besides his eyes, the only thing different from Hildebrand was a new, open wound through his neck, blood spilling from the opening and down his front. Above him stood Lisabetta, holding Hildebrand's sword, fresh blood flowing down its blade. Lisabetta's eyes were cold, empty, completely devoid of the light they once held. The front of her dress stained with speckles of blood. She examined Craven with an absent stare, seemingly nothing left behind her gaze. She parted her skirt, lifted her leg high enough to be level with Hildebrand's crimson-bathed throat before her heel made contact with his chest, sending body, sword, and head tumbling over the ledge and into the surging sea. Craven tried to reason with her, pleaded, even begged for her to see reason, but Lisabetta could not hear her brother's incessant wailing over the fury and anguish that swelled within her heart. Her fingers curled around the hilt of her final weapon with great care, caressing her thumb along the engraved C in her brother's pickaxe. The blade of the tool dragged behind her as she approached Craven. His prayers of mercy now changed to whispered apologies as he backed himself up against the cliff's ledge. Looking over his shoulder and seeing his fate below, Craven tried one last time to persuade his sister to reconsider. "Lisabetta, my dearest sister, please don't do this. I beg of thee. Please." There was a pause in Lisabetta's movements, letting a shrivel of hope creep into Craven's heart, but it was short-lived as Lisabetta muttered a query to her brother. "Did my beloved plead for his life the same way as you are now? Did he grovel for his master's mercy and pray to our Lord above for a shred of grace? Is this how he sounded when he was met with the blade that would decide his fate?" Craven attempted to protest, but was ultimately cut off by agonizing pain as Lisabetta lifted the pick above her head and plunged it deep into his left shoulder, rendering him unbalanced as he tumbled backwards over the cliff face, managing a quick glance at his sister's unmoving expression, watching him fall into the ocean's gaping maw below. Lisabetta watched silently as her youngest brother's body was swallowed by the surging waves. She felt nothing. There was nothing left in her heart to feel, no tears left to shed. With a calm, deep breath, Lisabetta retreated from the edge and approached the garden. She paid no attention to the body of her oldest brother, simply stepping over it as she walked beneath the mighty oak tree and sat at her lover's grave. She stared at the lifted mound for a moment, her eyes roaming its shape before they stopped on something that lit a small fire inside her heart. There, on her lover's grave, was the sprout of a damask rose. Its soft green seemed to glisten against the dark earth as the sun began to rise. With a soft smile, Lisabetta laid down beside her lover's grave. A singular tear fell down her cheek. Perhaps she had more tears to shed after all. The only AI I used was Grammarly. It just fixed spelling mistakes. I'm very tired. That's 40 minutes. That is insane. Okay, bye.